Hello everyone, I'm Troy, and yeah, today I want to talk about the new city builder survival game, Frostpunk 2. Have you ever wondered what running an early 20th century alternate history steampunk society would be like during an ice age? Oh, really? No? Well, developers 11-Bit Studios did, so they created Frostpunk back in 2018, which was pretty well received and generally cited as being the first game to sort of mesh the city builder and survival genres. And personally, I love the first Frostpunk. I didn't play it initially on release, but rather played it a few years later in like 2022, and I found it a very focused, unique, and rewarding city builder. Now, I'm not a massive city builder guy. I don't play them all, but occasionally one can just hit the right neurons in my brain, and it can suddenly be very hard for me to put the game down. And 2018's Frostpunk, it was one of those games. So when Frostpunk 2 was announced and the direction was seemingly bigger and better, with 11-Bit Studios really wanting to tackle a much larger scope, I was excited to give Frostpunk 2 a spin. And, well, after putting 30 hours into the game, beating the main campaign, and playing the Utopia mode, Frostpunk 2 feels a lot different from its predecessor. It's a pretty big departure. While I do believe a lot of this was a leap forward in a good direction, Frostpunk 2 does take a few steps back in other ways that I think is going to be tough for a lot of players. But hey, that's why we're here, isn't it? That's probably why you're watching this video. Let's go ahead and talk about all that. Real quick though, if you haven't already, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing. I just love to talk about video games here on this channel, so if you also enjoy video games, please subscribe. Thank you so much. Alright, so Frostpunk 2, as usual, I'll go ahead and give a brief synopsis of the game, then break down what I think worked and what I think didn't work, and give the game a final score out of 10. So, starting with the synopsis, what exactly do you do in Frostpunk 2? Bars. Well, in Frostpunk 2, you'll assume the role of the steward, which is a sort of leader or mayor or whatever you want to call it, of a city in an alternate history steampunk early 1900s, where the world has been ravaged by some sort of climate disaster that has created a sort of a new ice age. Essentially, the entire world is now a frozen ice ball, so naturally, surviving through this has proven very difficult for humanity. So, it's up to you as the steward to make sure the city, and eventually its colonies, are at the bare minimum surviving and perhaps even thriving if you are good enough. And you will accomplish this by making a variety of decisions and engaging with a number of different mechanics, such as managing the city's resources, ensuring everyone is fed and the generator has fuel, deciding where to place new specialized districts and buildings, researching new tech, exploring the surrounding map, or Frostland as they call it here. And the big new one here in Frostpunk 2 is engaging with the city's various communities, factions, laws, and ideologies. And there are two modes here in Frostpunk 2. One is your standard campaign, which is about what you would expect. It's essentially a 10-ish hour long tutorial mode that slowly exposes you to all of Frostpunk 2's various mechanics, as well as gives you some guided story beats to expose you to the world and setting. Then there is the Utopia mode, a sandbox mode that unleashes all of Frostpunk 2's mechanics on you with some randomized resources and Frostland elements to keep things feeling fresh, never frozen. So that's a very brief overview of Frostpunk 2, which this sequel still is very much a mixture of survival and city builder. However, it does really expand on the city management, or rather political management, compared to its predecessor. And it really does increase the scope and size of the city, but we'll get more into that soon. Alright, so now I always like to go ahead and start off on a positive note. Let's go and talk about what I liked about Frostpunk 2, which is a lot. For, first impressions, which are important, the game looks gorgeous. We will get to the performance later because that was a bit iffy, but in terms of both graphical fidelity and art style, I really enjoyed what I saw here in Frostpunk 2. From seeing your sprawling metropolis to zooming out and looking across the barren Frostlands, even to the art present on the vignettes of important events happening across your city, Frostpunk 2 is easy on the eyes. Now let's get into something a little more substantial. What's really impressive in Frostpunk 2 is the wide array of systems and mechanics and how they all kind of interact. Now some are definitely more interesting than others, but just the sheer amount at play here lends to a huge variability in any given playthrough. One of the new ones, and the one that I enjoyed the most, is the new factions system. With a much larger scope and population, your city will now form different communities. These communities have different values that align along 3 different axes, or axi? Axes, plural? I don't know, I'm a dumbass.
What are you? An idiot sandwich.
But the game also calls them zeitgeists. As you progress your city's zeitgeist, you direct it along these axes depending on a few different factors. And this will please or piss off certain communities, and eventually factions will form, which are just more politically organized and radical communities. And these factions can either give you benefits or, going the complete opposite way, they can fuck some shit up and cause even a civil war. Whether these factions are happy or pissed off is determined by so many different factors, such as the research that you conduct, the buildings that you build, and of course, the laws that are passed, which is a whole mechanic in itself that we will get to. There's even a mechanic called tension that, when erupted, can cause chaos and riots in your city. Then there's trust, which is just the people's general trust in you. All of these mesh and weave together in such a way that the whole factions and politics systems, it feels very delicate and, well, tense, as do sometimes real life politics, especially in my homeland of the United States right now. Shit's weird and crazy.
They're eating the dogs.
Then there are the laws that you help pass themselves, which are just a ton of fun to engage with. These are essentially just powerful buffs that range from deciding how to educate your children to radical ideas such as forced relationship rotations to increase birth rates. I had a lot of fun building different societies on subsequent playthroughs. Sometimes I would try to implement what I thought was right, and other times what benefits the city the most at that given time. Or perhaps I wanted to roleplay as a communist society that's labor force is made entirely up of genetically superior apex laborers, while simultaneously prescribing the entire population mandatory stimulants. It's good stuff. That's good stuff. And to pass these laws, you'll again need to engage with your communities and factions to secure votes on the council. You can do this by promising a faction something to secure their votes, or maybe just ensuring you're proposing a law that aligns with the majority of the seats. Or you can just roll the dice and hope that the hesitant voters vote in your favor. Factions even affect the research tree, which the research tree itself, it's fairly basic, but the twist here is that you assign specific factions or communities to research any given item, and that affects the building or the law that you unlock. It's pretty neat. On top of engaging with internal politics, Frostpunk 2 will also have you sending teams out into the external surrounding areas, or Frostlands. Similar to Frostpunk 1, you will still send teams out to secure resources and rescue groups of survivors, but now you can also form permanent settlements as well as full-fledged colonies that you will build yourself, effectively managing up to 4 cities at any one time, creating a network of trails and trading routes and sending settlers and supplies between them. And I really like this a lot. You can essentially create a little civilization amongst the Frostlands. One city might specialize in food production, another in oil. You might need to expand your routes to ensure enough supplies can be moved from one area to another. The Frostlands are also randomized for each Utopia run, so there is a good amount of replayability possible. This does feel like an evolution and the correct step forward for the Frostpunk formula. Alright, now let's go and talk about the negatives here, and a lot of this is just some missed opportunities. For one, I really don't think Frostpunk 2 took any meaningful steps forward when it comes to many of its other mechanics. It introduced this whole complex political and faction mechanic, but in terms of its more survival aspects and resource management, it's, Introduced a new type of fuel? Now you can use oil and steam along with coal to power your generator. Sure, but oil is easily the better option, so that doesn't really add much depth here. If anything, some of the depth was taken away because the heat mechanic has sort of been dumbed down to where all you really need to do is ensure you have enough fuel coming in versus being spent. There are these huge weather events called whiteouts, which are just like kind of blizzards, which they look cool, but all they really do is, drop the temperature a bunch, and sometimes will make collecting a specific resource difficult. And you can see these coming from a mile away, so you really only need to be somewhat aware and prepare accordingly. Then there are your 5 city problems, or whatever they call it on the top of your screen. Black little balls. These are decent and do require a bit of a balancing act, but essentially the only ones that matter far more than the other is cold. And so managing this isn't really too difficult. As long as you have enough resources coming in, you should be able to easily handle this. And really, that's all the survival part of Frostpunk is about, ensuring you have enough resources coming in. And like I said, this isn't awful. It still is satisfying to set up your extraction districts around certain resource nodes and kind of see everything start pouring in. But I just wish they had really leaned into this and created something a bit more complex, like they really leaned into the new political system. So this leads me into the issue that I've been seeing from a lot of other reviews, that Frostpunk 2 really loses its sense of intimacy and individual struggle because of its increase in scope. I do definitely agree with this. Like, I would rarely zoom in to look at the buildings I was constructing, and rather I was just making sure that I'm plopping down whatever building that would make whichever number go up or down accordingly. Also, just forget about caring about your city's layout or aesthetics. The buildings are all color-coded based on the district and don't look nearly as interesting as in Frostpunk 1. Now, I know I said that the city sprawl that's created here is visually impressive, and it is, but it really loses any sense of individual character because after multiple playthroughs, everything looks the same and any individual buildings are so tiny and unnoticeable. Also, really quick, let me talk about the performance, which for me was very inconsistent. The game runs great early on, but into the late game, once you have multiple cities to manage, this game chugged so hard. It crashed multiple times, and for some reason, just a simple quick save would sometimes take like 30 seconds. I get that frames might dip a little in games like this, especially when things get hectic into the late game, but Frostpunk 2 is way too inconsistent. Frostpunk 2 definitely needed some more time in the oven. But alright, hey, that's about it. There's a rundown of the highly anticipated Frostpunk 2, some of what I liked, and some of what I didn't like. The new political and faction system, I think, is great. It adds a completely new layer to this post-apocalyptic city builder. However, I think this won't be for everyone. Like, if you don't enjoy politics, or maybe if you have too strong of opinions, then Frostpunk 2's politics might be a bit boring. However, in terms of the resource game and the survival part, Frostpunk 2 does do a few things, but ultimately they don't feel like enough to justify dumbing down some of its previous systems, and overall, just a less intimate look into its world. So in the end, it feels like for every step forward that Frostpunk 2 takes, it takes a step back and is mired with performance issues, leaving me overall somewhat disappointed. So because of that, I'm gonna go ahead and give Frostpunk 2 a 7.75 out of 10. It's not that Frostpunk 2 is a bad game. No, it's a pretty good game and you can definitely have a pretty good time. But in the context of how amazing and revolutionary Frostpunk 1 was, Frostpunk 2 does disappoint. You know, I'd give the first Frostpunk probably like a 9. So to go from a 9 to a 7.75, that really isn't great. You know, perhaps 11-bit can sort of flesh out some of the more underwhelming systems and do a few things to add a bit more character back into its city builder with some expansions. Overall though, for only 45 bucks, if Frostpunk 2 at all interests you, I definitely recommend it. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. Also, do not be shy and leave a comment below and let me know what you think of Frostpunk 2. I'll see you next time and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.